Welcome back, everybody. I'm Kathy Kiely, the Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism, and I'm here on our campus in the studios of the Reynolds Journalism Institute, and I'm joined remotely by John Silva from the News Literacy Project. I really appreciate John taking the time to talk to us. The News Literacy Project is something I've known about for many years because back when I worked in Washington, D.C. for USA Today, Alan Miller, who I'm proud to say is a former journalist, founded the News Literacy Project, and my colleagues and I at USA Today were among the early volunteers who went into classrooms to talk to students a little bit about what we do. So it's really great to have John here. John is, by training, a teacher. And so one of the things we found working in the News Literacy Project was the importance of journalists partnering with teachers to develop lessons in this format. So it's really great to have somebody who knows his way around a classroom. As I've come into the teaching world through our journalism school, I'm very humbled because I see how hard it is to really teach, and so it's really great to have somebody like John who has been with us. I will say that those of you who are participating live can ask questions as usual through our chat function here on the MU Conference Center's hub. If you are watching this after the fact, you can still ask questions through our address newsliteracy@missouri.edu, and we will get those questions to John and any of our other speakers, and we'll have those available to you. I just also want to say that this is our last day for Friends of the Facts, but it doesn't mean we're going away. Our information and our videos of this session and all of our sessions will be available on the MU Conference Hub, and you can interact with this. And if you have friends who haven't registered and haven't participated, they have till close of business on Friday to go and register for this, and you will have access to all of the videos through this site. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to John and let him walk us through the News Literacy Project program. So thank you, John, for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy, for inviting me. I'm sorry we couldn't do this in person again. Maybe next year. So the focus of what I'm going to talk about is sort of what we at the News Literacy Project consider to be the foundational skills for teaching young people to be news literate, and kind of like what does it mean? Like, what are the essential skills? So I'm going to kind of go through this. The framework is a bit focused on learning objectives, student learning objectives, and what that's going to look like. I will pause at a couple of points for questions, but as always, if there is something important, Kathy's going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll see if we can be interrupted. So, my name is John Silva. I'm part of the education team at the News Literacy Project. I've been here for a little over 5 years. Prior to that, I was a social studies teacher in Chicago Public Schools for 13 years. And I actually was introduced to NLP with our old classroom program when I taught middle school a number of years ago. If you'd like to reach out to me directly after today's session, my email address is there at the lower left of your screen. And if you are active on Twitter, as I am, that's my Twitter handle there. It's my professional account. I do share a lot of things relating to news literacy and misinformation, and a little bit also about conspiracy theories. You can learn more about us at the News Literacy Project at our website at newslit.org. We are a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We have a lot of great resources available on our website, not just for educators, but also for the general public. And it is our mission, in particular, to bring news literacy not just to traditional classroom education with young people, but also just the importance of how much we need news literacy education for adults. Because being informed, being credibly and reliably informed, is absolutely critical to the strength of our country and how we're going to continue to operate. In our work, in particular with young people, we believe that news literacy is not something that's really optional. It's something we absolutely have to be doing, because there's a couple really important reasons for this. One of the things we have to remember, there's this pervasive myth that young people are digital natives, that somehow they're born with this innate ability to use technology, and it's just simply not true. They're using technology and accessing things at younger and younger ages, but we actually have to teach them deliberate skills and habits to be able to navigate this complex information landscape that they're growing up in. They have to be able to know what they can trust, how to verify information, and how to be credibly and reliably informed. And if we don't do this, we're actually putting them at a major disadvantage. So as I mentioned, this is going to be about the essentials. What are the three key, these are going to be sort of three broad ideas that we want to be teaching young people, but also I'm hoping that for adults, it's a little bit of a reminder of some of the things that we need to be doing consistently with the information that we take in and process. And one of the most important things is that we kind of have to recognize that there is news and there's kind of everything else. And there are so many things out there that we will see that look like news, but it's actually something else. And this is it on the surface, it seems overly simple. Well, news is news, and I can recognize it. But the reality is we don't always recognize it. And so this is an essential question that we want young people in particular to learn, but also adults need to ask this question when they see something, because not all information is designed to inform us as news is. There's so many other ways that information can be influencing us. And so we want to be able to break this down and recognize which is which. And so I'm going to outline this and show you some examples of what I mean here. So what is news? News, very simply, is anything that informs us. In particular, it comes from standards-based news organizations and journalists, in a sense that this is information that is supposed to be fair, impartial, and accurate, right? And so this is our definition of news. Right? And so what does that look like? So when we look at a news article, there are certain things that we should see, and there is some consistency. Right? News is written in a very specific way, and there should be this consistency. And so if we don't see any of these things, right? Or for example, if we see like for example hyperbole or superlatives in an article, it may not necessarily be a news article. It might be something else. And so we need to teach young people what news looks like. What does it mean for this article to be written to inform us in a way that is fair and accurate? And part of that also connects to what we call the standards of quality journalism. This is from one of our key lessons in the Checkology virtual classroom, which is about the reputable news organizations are trying to use these standards to report the events of the day in a way that is fair and accurate. Fairness and accuracy, these are words that we share a lot when it comes to journalism, right? So news is trying to follow these standards, right? So what about the other things? So there's some things that we need to look out for, because there's a lot of things that, like I said, look like news, but that it's actually not. And one of the most common things that people will often confuse is opinion pieces. When we see things that are about current events, but they're actually trying to persuade us. They're trying to get us to come around to a viewpoint. It's trying to get us to believe a certain thing. And so opinion pieces, also it's commentary, you might see maybe editorials, but the idea is that we need to recognize the difference between things that are informing us and persuading us. And for a lot of adults, we often just don't recognize the differences. And so I want to show you a couple of examples of what I mean. Here are two articles, both from the Washington Post, about the recent Supreme Court decision relating to Roe versus Wade. One of these is a news article that's telling us the who, the what, the where, the when, right? It's informing us of the details of the Supreme Court decision. So it's informing us. The other one, it's labeled perspective, right? But this is about persuasion. This is an opinion piece. And they're both published by the Washington Post. And so we have to recognize what to look out for when something is actually trying to persuade us. Here's another example. The Wall Street Journal actually, like some others, are starting to publish opinion pieces under separate social media accounts, right? So the Wall Street Journal has a main account for their news content, and then the opinion pieces from the editorial part of the Wall Street Journal, they have their own separate social media account. So this is something where we need to look out for when it comes to these opinion pieces. but also recognizing that these opinion pieces, when we see them in from reputable sources, there should be some evidence to support what they're trying to persuade us. There should be, logic and reason behind it, because the reality is also that especially on social media, there's a line that gets crossed from opinion into propaganda, and it's usually dependent on the source. But when we start talking about propaganda, we need to be able to recognize what we're talking about. And it's really about provocation. Propaganda is designed to try to manipulate us, especially manipulating our emotions through strong emotional appeals, using a lot of false information, taking things out of context, but also recognizing that there's some key differences, right? Opinion is supposed to be supported by evidence, whereas propaganda is trying to browbeat us into one particular view, and that's the only one that's valid. We can usually, although there is some emotion involved, we can usually evaluate opinion pieces through some sort of a rational, critical thought process. There's a really good resource on propaganda that I like to recommend from the museum. They developed this called Weed Out Propaganda. And they developed this taxonomy that they call SEED. And what I really like about this resource, about propaganda in particular, because there's a lot of propaganda out there, and it's not always coming from state sources like we traditionally think of it. But this taxonomy can be applied to all sorts of sources of propaganda, not just the classic curriculum we see with World War II posters, that sort of thing. We can really look at these things and use this to measure, is this something that's really trying to be opinion-based and persuasive, or is this about propaganda and it's about manipulation and provocation? There's two others that I want to mention in this, and there are some things that we don't often recognize. There are a lot of entertainment shows out there that use current events as their subject matter. Right, The Daily Show, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. There's a number of these shows out there that we can learn about things that are happening. Like we can learn about current events, but they're not created to inform us. They're using that as subject matter to entertain us. They're trying to get us to laugh at things. It will often incorporate satire, but a lot of it is also opinion based. And sometimes some of these shows will actually cross the line into propaganda in a way that's trying to provoke us into certain belief. So entertainment, yes, I can know what's going on with certain things watching Trevor Noah, but he's not trying to inform me. He's trying to make me laugh. And then one of the other ones, and this is particularly problematic on local television news stations in particular, but it happens across lots of news organizations, which is sponsored content. So this is a screenshot from a morning TV show in Tampa Bay where they had this called The Ideal Agent. He was talking about real estate, buying and selling a house. And he's being interviewed on this news program by one of the news anchors. But it's an advertisement that someone paid this news organization to interview him for this particular purpose. Now, the thing is that advertising such as this is supposed to be disclosed. It's supposed to be labeled in some clear way. But the reality is that sometimes it's not as clear. So this is what was at the very end of the segment, and it was on the screen for maybe about 5 seconds. And if you can look at that towards the bottom, you can see paid for by Ideal Agent. It is there, but it's not the most prominent thing on the screen. So sponsored content is another thing. It looks like it could be something that's informing us. It feels like it is, but it's actually trying to sell us a product or a service. And so that just to wrap up, to get back to this question, right? So this is the essential question when we're looking at something. If we're going to try to make a decision, or we're trying to be informed about what's happening, we have to really question our sources. We have to question the information that we're seeing and try to recognize, is this news coming from a standards-based news organization that's trying to inform me in a way that's fair and accurate and credible, or is this trying to influence me in some way? So I'm going to pause here really briefly to see if there are some questions about that first learning objective.
Thanks, John. I had a couple of observations that I wanted to share. I think your your points about discerning and distinguishing opinion from fact-based news is really, they're very important. And I think certainly we in the news business, and one of my colleagues here, Damon Kiesau, is working on this, to do a better job within news organizations in labeling news. I think that is, and labeling opinion. But I think one really important point to make is that in the old days, when most people consumed their information in a newspaper, there were sections that were clearly labeled that would say, this is the sports section, this is the op-ed page. And now I think we have a melding of that. You can still buy a newspaper. I know this is hard for some of my students to believe, but you can still buy a newspaper and you will still have those clearly delineated sections. But most people are consuming their news in the way that you showed it on the screen, which is via social media. And on a social media website, as your posts demonstrated, it all looks pretty much the same. So the opinion piece that you might click on from your Facebook is not as clearly labeled. And perspective is one word that might be interpreted as opinion, but I think this is what Damon is working on here at the Missouri School of Journalism, is what are better labels for that. But I think it's really, really important for consumers who are getting news on social media to understand that it is not always as well labeled. And I love the fact that the Wall Street Journal has a separate channel now for its opinion columns. I think that's so important. Are you seeing much more of that, or is the Journal really pioneering that? Do you know?
I don't know if the Journal was the first to do that. I know that the Washington Post does have a separate, they do have a separate account for things from their, mainly it's from their editorial pages, their editorial board, but they don't, so it's a weird distinction. If it's something that the Washington Post themselves publish as opinion or editorial, it's on the separate Twitter account. But if it's other things, like someone else has written an opinion piece for the Post, it goes on their main account. It isn't consistent. But I think that the challenge is that I think most news organizations are getting really good at labeling things as opinion or commentary. I think the challenge remains that we're still not paying close enough attention as individuals to what we're seeing, right? We're not, because we're processing things so quickly because there's so much information, right? We're not really thinking about things when we first see them. It's just, it's that initial like emotional reaction. We're reacting, we're not really thinking. And
yes, absolutely.
That's one of the biggest challenges.
And
that's one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, that gets to one of the other points that I think are so important. One of the things I said earlier in one of the sessions is that we want people to think more like journalists. And one of the slogans that we have in newsrooms is speed kills. And I think when we react too quickly without looking a little more carefully at, is this an opinion piece? Is this a current piece? Is this from last year? Is this from this year? If we don't do that, we can get in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. I think the important thing is that we have to remember about, so I kind of frame it as like first look, second look. When we first see something, unless we're actually deliberately trying to see things critically, more often than not, our first look is going to be emotional and it's going to be a reaction. It's when we go back and take a second look that we'll be looking at things more critically. And that's when we will more often recognize when something is not informing us. And it's that second look that we need people to really practice doing when we're trying to, if we're going to share something, if we're going to make a decision using something, and that sort of thing.
100%. I also think, you made the point about propaganda, and I think it's important, I think, to point out to a lot of our listeners and to anybody who's consuming information now online that the very thing that you talked about, sponsored content, that is also something that is very prevalent online, and sponsored content doesn't necessarily have to be ads. I mean, we are identifying ourselves with every click, every like, every online transaction we make, And those transactions are being used to kind of pigeonhole us and identify certain kinds of, it doesn't just affect the advertising we get, it affects the news feeds we get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's also related to the sort of the algorithms that are curating whatever our current feed is.
Okay, well, why don't we go ahead with the rest of your presentation? Thank you.
Yeah. So the first piece we were trying to focus on, what can we use to inform us? The next piece to the foundation of news literacy is recognizing when something just simply is not true, right? And so I want you to just take a quick second to think about how would you define misinformation? And this is one of those things that when you first think about it, it seems simple, but then the more you think about it, it does tend to get a little bit more complicated when you're trying to define it. Because the reality is that misinformation is a very broad term. When we think about the sort of classic definition, anything that is one of these things can be considered misinformation. And what's also really important to remember is that when we start with the basic definition, is that intent is a separate part of the conversation. Intent doesn't really factor into whether or not something is simply factual or not. And so the first challenge is that so many things can be considered misinformation. That's part of it. The second problem, and this is something that has especially started happening in the last couple of years, is that the term misinformation has been weaponized and politicized in much the same way that fake news was during the 2016 election and the years following. So people are calling things misinformation as a strategy to dismiss things. And so much like we used to dismiss things as fake news, we're dismissing things as misinformation, not because they're not true, but because we don't like it or we disagree with it. So when we're teaching young people about misinformation, we have to start here, but then we actually have to get to a more accurate vocabulary so that we can talk about it in a more nuanced way. And then especially when we start talking about intent. Intent is most important when we're talking about disinformation. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people will use these interchangeably, but the reality is disinformation has a very clear intent behind it, right? Disinformation has this intent that it has been intentionally created and knowingly created to be false, and it is shared to deceive people into thinking that it's true. So one of the first things that we try to do, one of the basic concepts, is to define key types of misinformation. So we have a taxonomy of 5 types of misinformation. 4 of these we have tried to define by their characteristics, not by their intent. And because this is something that's very important, is like intent is a different part of the conversation. One of them, the 5, which is satire, does have intent behind it, and I'll try to explain that. So we want to understand, like, what does it look like? So one of the most common types of misinformation is called manipulated content. And so basically the idea is that you take something from its original form and you change it in some way. And Photoshop is one of the most common, but there are other kinds that are out there. But when you manipulate something that's original and you change it, you have created manipulated content misinformation. So in this example, someone took an image from President Zelensky from his official Instagram account. Obviously, they manipulated the jersey and they added the swastika to it. So simply through that Photoshop of just that one piece of the image, they created this very dark piece of misinformation. One of the others that's also very, very common. Now, this little screenshot does not have any audio, but this is called false context. So this is where you take something from its original form and you change its description. You change the context in some way. You create misinformation. So this was video that went viral in late February during the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, claiming that there's this Ukrainian fighter pilot, the Ghost of Kyiv, and he's shooting down Russian jets left and right. And so this is video of him shooting down a Russian jet. This is a real video. It's just from a computer game. It's actually a computer simulation game, and somebody repackaged it and put it out there. like this. False contacts is also very, very common. There's actually one that was going viral today. Somebody shared a picture of a mural. It was actually from like 1994, I think, or no, it was from 2010. Anyway, there's this painting of children wearing masks, and the masks are these flags, and people have been sharing it out of context, claiming that it's recent. It's from the Denver airport. But just by taking things out of context, it's very easy for people to believe that they're true. What we used to call fake news, we try to describe more now as fabricated content. It's the idea that everything about it is made up, but it's designed to look like it's authentic, right? So in this case, we have an article from a website called Real Raw News claiming that the Biden presidency, the administration said that vaccines are more important than baby formula. Nothing about it is real. It's not a real news site. It's not a real article. The image is real, but it actually has nothing to do with what the article is claiming. But basically, it's designed to look like an authentic source, but nothing about it is real. Somewhat similar often is imposter content, but it has a key difference. So what you're seeing here is a screenshot of a Big Bird tweet claiming to be responding to a tweet from Senator Ted Cruz. Big Bird does actually have a Twitter account, but somebody used a website or an app to create this fake tweet, making it look like Big Bird was criticizing Senator Cruz. So by using the image and the account of Big Bird, is trying to make us believe that it's authentic. So when we use a celebrity or maybe a corporation, in this case, a beloved Sesame Street Muppet, it makes us think that it's authentic, and it's using that notoriety or well-known name to make us believe that it's real. So those are the four main types of misinformation that you can define based on their unique characteristics. The last one that gets a little complicated, but it's really important to talk about, is satire. So we all probably could come up with a basic definition of satire, right? It's usually about humor and hyperbole. It's usually about trying to criticize maybe a politician or a policy, right? It is a form of commentary in some ways. So the thing about talking about satire in the context of misinformation is we're not really talking about whether or not something is satire. It's really about the ways that satire can be used to create or further misinformation. One of the things that's really important to remember when we're talking about satire is Poe's law. So if you're not familiar with Poe's laws, that basically, unless something is clearly labeled or described as satire, and it's related to something that people have extreme views of, unless it's labeled, people with those views will easily mistake it as being authentic. They won't recognize it as parody or satire. And this goes to the emotional reasoning when people just are responding as opposed to really critically thinking. So the thing is that we know and we expect satire sources to tackle very divisive issues, right? So these are examples. There's satire about various things relating to transgenderism. The one on the right actually got the Babylon Bee's Twitter account suspended, right? We don't necessarily want to talk about whether or not these are legitimately satire, but we want to talk about how they can further other types of misinformation. But what's really important, though, is that people don't always recognize satire when they see it, right? So this example, this happened last month. So it was a relatively minor news story, but basically Nintendo announced that the public investment fund from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had purchased a 5% stake in Nintendo. And a few news organizations reported it, some gaming blogs and such. It wasn't really a major story, but people did report on it. And then this article was posted by Hard Drive Magazine, claiming that as a result, Nintendo said that female characters will no longer be able to drive in Mario Kart. And this obviously connects to some things about the policies and laws in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and connects to a lot of people with strong beliefs about some of these issues. But the thing is, Hard Drive Magazine is a satirical website. But the problem is that for this, so this is when their original tweet. There's nothing on here that labels it as satire, right? And if you go to the profile page of their Twitter account, it says video game news for gamers by gamers, right? So it has no label there as satire. If you go to their website, they describe them, this is how they describe themselves, a very real video game news site, right? So, but there's nothing about this that calls it satire. And so this is the challenge, is that how clearly should these be labeled, and how can people sort of take this out of context? And so here's some examples of our people, used their beliefs or had their beliefs manipulated to share the story as if it was authentic. And you can see how this connects to some people's beliefs and the emotional connections people have to some of these issues. And so satire, can be used to manipulate us, or our own biases can work against us into believing that something is authentic when it's not. And so being able to recognize satire and being able to have discussions about satire in this context is what's really important in terms of misinformation. So that's sort of the key entry point to misinformation. Being able to recognize the different types. There are some deeper conversations to go into once to talk about motivations and some of the other things that happen. But this is the entry point, is emphasizing, like, what does it look like? What do we need to be watching out for?
That's great, John. A couple observations again I wanted to make, because I thought you made some really important points there. One is, and this relates to an earlier session we had, and you can see the video of that session online with Professor Scott Christensen. He talked about deep fakes, but one of the other points he made, and I know Taylor Freeman, who was moderating that session, was really fascinated by it, as was I, is this, what deepfakes produce is something called a liar's dividend. And I think that feeds directly into what you're talking about the mislabeling of fake news. Something is biased or fake if it's news that I don't like. And it's that, I think, don't you, has become easier to convince people of, because there is so much fakery out there. And I think that's what Scott is referring to when he says the liar's dividend. It's easy to label something as fake or dismiss it as not real or biased because of what we're seeing. And that's one reason we really have to combat that, right?
Yeah, this is one of the fundamental challenges when we get into sort of the underlying beliefs that fuel a lot of this misinformation. And the other aspect of this would be motivated reasoning. So an example that I actually just tweeted earlier today. So somebody had posted this picture of a mural, falsely claiming that it was evidence that the pandemic was planned, right? Someone responded to that, and they said, well, that's actually not from what you're claiming it is, but I'm not saying that it wasn't planned, right? So even if one particular piece of information is debunked, right, people can then turn around and still say, well, that maybe that's not true, but it could be true because I believe these other things. And it's that motivated reasoning that people really kind of continually engage in, because they just want to reinforce what they feel is true, regardless of whether or not they can prove it.
You talked also about the use of images and the use of video, out of context or manipulated video. And I know one of our other presenters talked a lot about reverse image search as a very useful tool. TinEye is, of course, a very good site for reverse image search, as is Google. Google has a great reverse image search. Are there other resources you use, and do you still, I know I've recommended in the past, the Amnesty International has a site where you can enter a YouTube URL and get information about when that video was made, where it was produced, which often can provide important context that is debunking.
So I think the challenge is that there is a point where So there's kind of a dividing line. There are ways that we can verify things fairly quickly, for most of us. We'll talk about the three key skills, including reverse image search. But there is a point where sort of the skills needed to verify something get more advanced. And the thing is, like, I think that there are some things that we should try to verify for ourselves, but then we should also sort of identify the fact-checking organizations that we would more commonly rely on, right? So we can do a certain amount of verification for ourselves, but we actually might be able to find out information far more quickly and accurately by going through the fact-checking organizations and the people who are doing the digital forensics, right? So being able to do a deep dive into like the metadata of an image, or like the checking out the source of a YouTube video, right? We can learn how to do that, but the reality is, for the overwhelming majority of the things that we would want to verify, we're not going to go to that level of detail.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think a lot of our readers have said, what is and our listeners have said, how can I do this? You know, it seems very overwhelming. I kind of like to tell people how to think like a journalist, because it's a little bit like a detective story and it's kind of fun. Mm-hmm. But I agree with you that there are time limits on that, and so ascertaining reliable sources, learning how to read laterally, and also just use, there is an app that I like to tell people about that is a really great app for detecting fakes in news. And what's really good about this app is that you don't need a plug and you don't need a phone, and it's with you all the time. It's the one between your ears. And some of the things you showed are so, you know, it's just common sense test. Does it pass the common sense test? And or is this something I just want to believe so much that I have to retweet it immediately? We do have one other question from Seth Smith, who's one of our speakers in an earlier session and works for the Daniel Boone Regional Library, raises a point that's a little bit painful to me, because of course I like to view journalism organizations as a reliable source, but he raises the point that even the New York Times has been accused of putting out information that was slanted or not fully vetted. And he raises the example of Judith Miller, whose stories really, I think, helped fuel the support for the Iraq War. And I will say this, the Times has subsequently apologized for that and acknowledged that not all of its sources were, or all of its stories were fully checked out. But talk a little bit about that, and how do we talk to people who are navigating this, and even reliable news sources that have all these checks in place can sometimes go off the rails?
That actually can get really complicated, but so I'll try to break it down into kind of two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, there is the issue of when a reporter or a news organization, they make a mistake. They report something that turns out to not be true. And then you have issues of bias, like the example that Seth was raising. So the first one is actually kind of straightforward, right? News organizations, they have processes in place to verify information, and they want to be fair and accurate in their reporting, but you know, people are human, they make mistakes. Reputable, credible news organizations will issue corrections when they make those mistakes. So this is one way that people criticize news organizations. You know, hey, look, you're spreading misinformation because you published this thing that turned out to not be true. But the reality is that, you know, mistakes happen, and mistakes can happen legitimately in some ways. So recognizing when a news organization holds themselves accountable and they issue corrections and say, hey, we got this wrong. Here's what we actually determined was accurate, and so that we're correcting the information. And even in some cases, you know, issuing a retraction. We discovered that none of the, you know, there's a lot of flaws in this, and so we're actually retracting the story entirely, right? That's holding themselves accountable, and you know, being upfront about it and saying, hey, we made a mistake, and here's what we did to correct that mistake. On the other hand, the other part of this is when there are breakdowns in the systems that are meant to minimize bias, right? So there are ways that bias creeps into news reporting, even when they're taking steps to minimize it. So, one example, flawed sourcing is one example. If we're only emphasizing a certain segment of sources or certain types of sources, right? That's a type of journalistic bias that we need to call out. And then when it's called out, that news organization needs to acknowledge it and take steps to correct it. And so, this is the big challenge: is that no system is perfect. There's no way that we can completely eliminate bias from news reporting. And in some ways, trying to, using the word objective or objectivity, making that the standard is almost an impossible standard to reach, which is why I so often will describe it as fair and accurate, right? Is this coverage fair and accurate? And is it reported in a way that is trying to follow these standards of quality, of quality, reputable journalism? So yeah, there are all sorts of ways that we can critique and call out news organizations and individual reporters when we see that they've crossed a line, or they're not doing things ethically and responsibly. We need to be watching out for the ones that don't do anything about it.
Yeah,
right?
I think
the New York Times.
I think the example that Seth highlighted is one where you had talked about a pattern. Is there a pattern of bias? And I think you could certainly see that there. The other thing I will say, because this happened when I was a reporter, there were other news sources that questioned some of that reporting. And one of them was USA Today. One of my colleagues, Barbara Slavin, who was covering the same build-up to the war and really raised some questions about this. And the other, famously, because there was a movie made about it, was Knight Ridder, and had a couple of reporters who were really questioning the rationale behind going to war, and were there weapons of mass destruction, and which turns out there weren't. So I think one of the things, and you're probably going to talk about this, and we'll let you go on with your presentation, but I think, as you said, nothing is perfect, and like the man said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So I think what we would ask our news consumers is to read widely and listen widely, because there are going to be people. The great thing about the news ecosystem we live in is that you have a lot of different perspectives available to you, and that empowers you if you know what you're doing as a reader and a news consumer.
One really important thing I would add to that, reading widely, listening widely is obviously critically important, but I think we also need to be reading, watching skeptically, not cynically, right?
Great
Skepticism
point. Great distinction.
Is so important in this, because if we approach this with cynicism, if we approach this from this lens that, like, well, you can't trust any of them, well, then you're never going to be credibly informed, because you're never going to accept that you can get information from a lot of sources. So it's one of the foundational aspects of news literacy, is that we want to use healthy skepticism and not cynicism. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges we have with adults and talking about news and information, is that so many of us have edged more and more into cynicism, and it's not a healthy way to view the world.
No, and I think it's what the enemies of democracy really want. They want us to fall prey to cynicism. And one of them, you put an example of the faked photo of Ukrainian President Zelensky. That's Vladimir Putin's disinformation shop working overtime. And I think trying to undermine, and we certainly know, we've seen examples of that disinformation in our own country. If you don't have the military power to undermine a democracy, you do it by pitting people in that democracy against each other, and I think we really have to be on guard for that. So, on to the next segment.
Okay, so how do we know? How do we verify some things for ourselves? So we just kind of introduced this a little bit, but when we're talking about the basics, these are things that we can do ourselves to be able to verify information, and these are very simple skills. And they're ones that we can use quite regularly. And so one of the ones that I want to mention is, we call it Googling like a pro. In some resources, you may, so for example, from the Stanford History of Education group, they talk about lateral reading, right? So, but the idea is that we need to know how to search for information in a way that we can learn context, we can find evidence, we can see what other people are saying about this information, we can see what other people are saying about the source of that information. And it's the idea that through a deliberate search, we can gain a level of confidence for ourselves that we can act on this information, or we can ignore it completely because it's not true, or it's perhaps biased in some way. But this is about getting information. We have to have a certain level of confidence that the information that we're using to inform our decisions is credible. So we have a resource that we can share on our website. You can find it. It's called 8 Tips to Google Like a Pro. We developed this with Cindy Otis. She's the author of True or False, a CIA Analyst Guide to Spotting Fake News. She's an amazing resource. If you're a librarian, or if you've worked with librarians, these are going to be very familiar, because we've been trying to teach people how to do this for years. Ever since we started being able to search the internet. These are ways of searching that have been around for as long as the internet has been around. But we need to remember, and maybe in some cases relearn, how to use some of these to make sure that our search results are as accurate as we need them to be. And then critical observation. We often don't think about the importance of just simply pausing and taking a closer look at something. I kind of said earlier that our first look is more often than not going to be an emotional response. We're going to see something, and we'll process it through how we feel about it, or what it makes us feel. Critical observation is that second look. Is when we go back to it and we look at it with a more critical eye. And what happens in that second look is that we are now using the more critical parts of our brain as opposed to the emotional, right? So here's a great example, right? We don't often recognize that not all misinformation is political, right? So here's this picture of Steve Irwin and Mr. Rogers, and Mr. Rogers is wearing this Good Vibes Only T-shirt, right? And so when we first see this, we have, there's a bit of an emotional response. It's not a strong one necessarily, right? But is it authentic? We might just see this, we might just pass it by, or we might share it. We don't really even think about whether or not it's accurate. But so let's take a second look. What can we see? So I'm just going to ask you to take a second and take a close look at it. What do you see in this image that might make you question it? And I'm going to put Kathy on the spot and see if she will do a little close look and tell me what she sees.
Well, the first thing I say is too good to be true. The rainbow in the background, really?
Okay.
And there's something about Mr. Rogers' face and I can't quite pinpoint what it is that makes me feel like it's photoshopped. And I wish I knew what that was. But yes, that app between my ears is kind of buzzing, and it doesn't look, it doesn't make sense.
So the thing about the faces, they have different sort of lighting and shading, right?
Oh, good
Mr.
point.
Rogers'
Yeah,
face
the light's
is
coming
softer, right? And then if you see the Mr. Rogers' shoulder, like there's distortion there going all the way down the arm. And so there you can see that. So it's a little fuzzy, a little blurry there. You could also the rainbow, too good to be true, but then also like a couple of things of skepticism, right? Would Mr. Rogers be wearing a Bob Ross T-shirt like this? But also like under what circumstances would these two men be together to sort of take this image? So just through some basic observation, we can become skeptical about this. So then what do? So we can Google it, right? So we want to be accurate. So we just put in, Steve Irwin, Mr. Rogers, and Bob Ross shirt, because we're trying to make sure we get all the details as possible. And so the thing is that when we first see the search results, we have in the collage, there's one thing that has a false label on it. So there is something that suggests that it's not authentic, but also the first two results that pop up the summary actually says it's altered. Like the fact check from USA Today says altered. Reuters calls it an altered image. And so, these initial results are telling us that it's not authentic. We scroll down, we see more fact checks, but we have to be careful with what we're scrolling in our search results, because then towards the bottom, Google is trying to be helpful, right? And trying to show us these T-shirts that we can buy, but it's actually not helpful for what we're trying to fact check. So just by doing a simple Google search, we found 4 different fact checks that showed us that it wasn't authentic, and it took all of 20 to 30 seconds. And as you mentioned, we could also do a reverse image search. So one thing that's actually important, I don't know a lot of people realize this, but Google has actually changed the way that you can do a reverse image search. It used to be you would right click and it would say search Google for image, but now Google is sort of forcing you to use Google Lens, right? But the way this works is you right click on the image, the menu pops up, and it says search image with Google Lens. And what's going to do is, so Google is going to try to identify different aspects of the image, right? So it correctly identifies the three men, right? So we've got all 3 of them. But then it's giving us some information about Bob Ross. And then it's giving us matching images. But the thing is that those matches are just different versions where people are sharing the same false image. I do have one link to Snopes. But in Google Lens, if you don't get good results right away, you can scroll down to the bottom and it will say, retry it with Google Images. And it will reload it and search it from the classic Google image search. And the same thing, it's going to match us up with the fact checks, one from Reuters, one from Snopes. But then it also is showing us the things that where other people are sharing it. So in some ways, yeah, a reverse image search can be a helpful tool, but it's not necessarily going to be as accurate as doing a simple Google search. So just to sort of bring it together, this is a composite of a couple different images. So Mr. Rogers was originally wearing David's tomato sauce shirt. It was actually posted to their Instagram account. Steve Irwin was originally posing with his father Bob. But the interesting thing, I don't know if you can see it clearly here, is that that image was also flipped. So in the original image, Steve Irwin's dad was on the left, and Steve Irwin was on the right. So he was posing with his dad, Bob, and then again they added the rainbow. So that's the thing, is like through some basic searching, we can verify things fairly quickly. And the last thing I'll just mention with this is we don't have to do this for every single piece of information that comes across our social media feeds. That's overwhelming. It's honestly a waste of time. But if we're going to use something, if we're going to take a social media post, an article, and if we're going to share it, or if we're going to use it as part of some sort, forming a decision, if we're just going to incorporate it into something that we already believe or already processing, that's when we have to do some verification. That's when we have to make sure that this piece of information that I'm going to use in some way, I have verified that it is authentic, that it is factual. Because we're overwhelmed by information and we can't check everything. But we have to remember that there are certain times when we should. So hopefully with these three key concepts, and I really sort of emphasized, just how complicated this is and why this is so very important. And I'm hoping that if you're an educator out there, you'll reach out to us at the News Literacy Project. You can contact us at our website at newslit.org. All of our resources for educators are free. We have a number of events coming up for the new school year, some new resources that we're going to be launching over the summer. And so I will sort of stop here to see if there are some final questions.
Okay. John, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through this. And I think if we send people to the News Literacy Project site, will it be easy to find the Google Like a Pro? Or
Yep.
And you have a newsletter, right? Correct? That people can sign up for?
We have a couple of newsletters, actually. So if you go to our website, newslit.org, and you click on For Educators, you will find all of our resources, including Newslit Nation, which is our educator network that we're building. to create a supportive, collaborative community of educators who are doing this work. We have our resource library where you can find resources like Google Like a Pro. And you can also subscribe to some of our newsletters. One is the SIFT. It's on summer break, but it's a weekly email that goes out every Monday, which has recent examples and issues relating to journalism and misinformation and strategies for using it in the classroom. We have a number of others that we put out for different audiences, including Get Smart About News, which is for the general public. All of that is at newslit.org. And you can find all of those things. It's laid out pretty well, so it's pretty easy to find things. And you can also find the links to the Checkology Virtual Classroom, which is our online learning platform for teaching these concepts and many others in news literacy.
And I will say the Google Like a Pro is a great resource. We do similar training for our journalism students here, and I'm going to add that to the mix for our librarians. And I'm going to add 2 tips to the Google Like a Pro. One, which I tell people, one, if you are looking at a social media feed and you see a piece of information that piques your interest, makes you want to share it, the first thing I would do is say, can you click through to an actual website? If you can't, I'm not saying it's not right, but I would be a little suspicious. Is there a link? And John, feel free to, come back at me. But the other thing, and then once you get to that website, does it have an about page that tells you something about who put that website together? And can you reach people at the website? Are there ways, either by email or phone, preferably both, that you can find out or reach somebody so you could complain or you could ask a question? And if the website doesn't have that, I would be suspicious. And third, does the website have a correction section? Are there corrections? Because to err is human, as you pointed out, but to correct is professional. And so a professional organization is going to care enough about its reputation and the reputation of the people it is reporting on that they will correct the record if they make a mistake. So those are 2 things I would add. But do you have any response to that? Or additional tips?
No, I think those 2 are very, very important. But I would put an intermediate step in there, which is before you go to their website and start looking for an about page, I would Google them, right? I would go see what other people are saying about them, because if it's a a fake news website, or if it's something other than a news organization, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of what they're saying about themselves, because they may be deliberately misleading. But if I do a simple Google search, I can find out, oh yeah, that's actually a satire site, or that is a fake news website, and then I don't have to waste time going to their website, because if I find out that they're just not legitimate, then I don't have to waste my time doing that. But if they seem to be, or are trying to be, a legitimate source of news and information, then I can go to their website and I can do a little bit more digging and see, and then look for those things, right? I can look for their about page. I can look for their corrections. But, that's just part of our due diligence. Once we recognize that they could be legitimate, that's when we take those steps, like, okay, how legitimate are they?
Right. And as you said, we cannot check every bit of information that comes across our screens, but we also don't have to publish every piece of information that comes across our screen. So I think that is, to me, and I have a video on our website that talks a little bit about the history of the information revolution that I lived as a newspaper reporter. And I would say the biggest change is that when I started out my career, in order to publish, you had to work for an organization that had a printing press or a big antenna, and that meant a lot of money involved in it, and that also meant assets, real estate assets, trucks to deliver the paper, big pieces of complicated equipment if you were a radio or TV station, and that was a lot to lose in a libel case. Now, my students can publish just by going to their smartphone, but they have, and we all have, something that is much more valuable than trucks or real estate or antennas or servers that we can lose, and that is our reputation. So I think just pausing, and if you don't have time to check, resist that urge, right, to republish or send it out.
I usually say verify before you amplify.
That's a good one.
It
Good
is
bumper sticker.
it is so very easy to like, comment, retweet in a split moment where we're reacting to something, right? But before you do that, before you share anything, before you repost it or whatever, you have to make sure that what you're doing has been verified, because, like you said, that's your reputation on the line. Everything that you put out on social media, that is your reputation. And if you become known as someone who will share things that just aren't true, then people just aren't going to trust you.
And before I let you go, John, let me just ask you this, because in one of our sessions yesterday, we had some librarians on who talked about sometimes just being overwhelmed by despair. Are you hopeful? And if so, why? Where would you be on the emotional temperature gauge right now? And what do you do to maintain your own resilience?
I'm angry a lot of the time with some of the things that I see on social media in particular. But then again, I spend more time in misinformation and conspiracy spaces than most people do. But I am very hopeful, and I will tell you why, is that the people who are deep in these beliefs, they are very, very vocal and they are very loud, but I think they're in a distinct minority. I think that we perceive them as having an outsized voice for really the size of their population. And I think most people can genuinely recognize when something is kind of too crazy to believe. But I think we're also at a point where more of us are talking about misinformation. More of us are calling it out when we see it. More of us are learning how to verify for ourselves. And I think that especially this generation, while they like all young people can be easily manipulated, I think they are learning how to be better consumers of news and information. So I'm generally hopeful. I think if I wasn't, I wouldn't be doing this work, because if I didn't have hope and skepticism and the ability to think that we can make this better, then I would find another line of work.
Well, that's a great note to end it on. And John Silva of the News Literacy Project, I really want to thank you for spending an hour of your day with us, because I know the work you're doing is really, really important. And for those of you who are watching, either on right now, live, or will be watching later at your leisure, you can reach out. John's information and slides are on the website, so you can reach out to the News Literacy Project directly. Or you can email us at newsliteracy@missouri.edu. And I want to thank everybody for joining this session. We will be reconvening at 2 p.m. Central to hear from Professor Monique Louisi of the Missouri School of Journalism about social media and health and how those two things work together and are sometimes at odds. So rejoin us then at 2 p.m. And in the meantime, have a great rest of your day.